So what I'm about to share with you right now is everything that I've learned over the last 5 years of my life. I've spent over $100,000 out of my pocket, and it changed how I think about every client that I'm working with now. Now, the reasons for this change is because the old way of thinking almost cost me my daughter's life. This change is also the reason why I decided to come back to YouTube, why I decided to do the podcast after being away for almost a decade. My name is Andrew Reid. I founded Medgeeks in 2013. And in this video, what I want to do is I want to share what happened and what is about to change with this channel. Now, to tell it right, I want to take you back to when it all started. So it's 2013. I'm 24 years old and I'm just out of PA school. I'm working 6 days a week in a very busy primary care OB-GYN clinic. On a slow day, I'm seeing anywhere between 30 to 40 patients, and on a busy day, I'm seeing anywhere between 60 and 70 patients. Now, most of these patients are uninsured, which means by the time they're seeing me, they're sick, they're complex because, well, frankly, they didn't have the proper preventative care, right? Now, at this point, I'm 1 year into my career, and I'm learning fast, mostly because, well, I have no other choice. But it's exciting, it's new, right? And so at that point, I also decided to do something else. I decided to start Medgeeks. So being a PA was my day job. But before and after work, I would record podcasts, I would write for the blog, I would do my research. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. every single day, do the research, publish everything I've been reading, go to work, and then come home and stay up till midnight writing and recording the podcast. There wasn't any specific plan for any of this, right? During school, I spent a lot of time piecing together a lot of resources, a lot of study guides, prepping for exams, the boards, and I knew I wasn't the only one. All of my classmates had the same problem. There wasn't any material that was of high quality that would help us get through both our in-class exams, the end of rotations, and the boards. And so this is part of the problem that I initially built Medgeeks to solve. Now, for the first few years, that's what Medgeeks was. It was a platform to help PAs and NPs pass their exams, their rotations, and their boards. Now, initially, it was just me and the microphone. But then 2017 came, and the business had grown at that point, right? So I decided, or I had to decide, I should say, how I wanted to spend my time. It was time to decide if I wanted to continue Medgeeks full time. Now, truth is, it wasn't that hard of a decision. I lost my passion for medicine at that point, and I lost passion for the practice itself because it was repetitive, it was monotonous, it was the same thing over and over. Every single patient got the same workup, they got the same prescription. I felt like I was on this hamster wheel and I was just running algorithms with no real critical thinking involved, no personalization. And so it just became mundane. I felt like I was just checking off the boxes inside of a system that really didn't want to be slowed down. And it wasn't a problem with my clinic. It wasn't a problem with my employer per se. It was the system itself. It was the same system that I was trained in and the same system that I was teaching to everybody at Medgeeks. And I just stopped finding it interesting altogether. But it was more than that. I was burnt out. And so I left clinical practice. I went full time with Medgeeks. And the truth is that I never really wanted to be the face of this company. I wanted to run the business. I wanted to do the operations. I wanted to grow the team. I wanted to do all of that. And so what I ended up doing was I ended up bringing a lot of clinicians on board, various PAs, various physicians who would do the clinical work, who would do the podcasts, who would do the YouTube, and who were, quite frankly, at that point, better suited teaching in the format that we were teaching at the time. Now, truth be told, they still had the kind of passion for that specific type of material that I had just lost. And I'm honestly incredibly grateful for every single clinician who kind of carried the torch over all those years. And many of you guys have been with us maybe you've been with us since when I was on the microphone, maybe not, maybe you joined afterwards. Either way, if you're here, I want to give you a sincere thank you. You became part of a community of individuals doing some of the most important work in our country. And the fact that you've trusted Medgeeks throughout the years as a trusted resource, it's not something that I take lightly. So once again, I just want to say thank you. This company exists because of you, and it's not the other way around. Now, but underneath all of that, the passion that made me start this at 20-something years old was gone, right? And all honestly, this line of thinking paralleled every single conversation that I had with every other PA and P physician. I wasn't the only one that was burnt out. I wasn't the only one that lost their passion, right? And I think anyone who's been a part of this system for a long enough time eventually experiences this. And then 2021 came and everything changed. In 2021, my daughter was born. Now, within a matter of months, everything that I thought that I understood about health and disease began to come apart. Everything collapsed because the hardest patient that I ever had turned out to be my daughter. She was 6 months old when her symptoms first started, and the first thing we noticed was petechiae. So we ordered a CBC, which revealed a platelet count of 2,000. That led us straight to the emergency room with a one-way ticket for admission, and I'll be honest with you, this was scary. It was a very scary experience. This was the first time that I was on the other side of the system, and it really put a lot of things into perspective for me. It's one thing to manage a patient that you see them once a month. It's another thing entirely to live it, to experience everything 24/7, 365, the minutes and hours in between each visit that no provider will ever bear witness to. Those are the moments, right, that we just don't see as clinicians. We see the snapshots, but we don't see the day-to-day. And so it gave me a whole new perspective, and it gave me a whole new empathy for this side of the system. Now, shortly after my daughter's first birthday, she developed lupus. And it's not really a condition that you typically see in a 1-year-old. Very rare. ANA was positive, the anti-double-stranded DNA was positive, beta-2 glycoprotein, cardiolipin, and antihistone antibodies, everything was elevated. The serological picture at this point looked like a cross between lupus and antiphospholipid syndrome and ITP. Now, around that same time, we did whole genome. And so her whole genome came back and it showed a positive mutation. She was positive for the M3243AG mutation in the MTTL1 gene, which is a mitochondrial mutation. And she carried a 90% heteroplasmy. This is the classic MELAS, for anyone that is familiar with that term, which stands for mitochondrial encephalopathy, lactic acidosis, and stroke-like episodes. Now, for those who don't know, heteroplasmy, this is what we basically call, or we deem, the amounts of mitochondrial DNA that has a mutation. So in other words, 90% heteroplasmy means that 90% of her mitochondrial DNA, in the sample anyway, had a mutation. That means that only 10% of the mitochondrial DNA that we sampled was normal. So 90% is extraordinarily high. It's a very high mutant load, and honestly, it carries a particularly difficult prognosis. Every single paper that I read showed a grim prognosis. The papers didn't show favorable outcomes either to someone who was diagnosed with autoimmune disease, especially at her age. And the papers definitely didn't show favorable outcomes when it came to having a mutant load as high as 90%. Independently, each situation was bad. And she had both. She had a mutation, or she had three things, and a high mutant load, and she had autoimmune dysfunction. So in my eyes, after seeing all of this honestly felt like a death sentence. Now, over time, I began to realize these papers are flawed, right? Because the research is biased. And they're biased to the circumstances which are severe because, after all, it's the severe cases that end up being the cases that we want to write about. The other thing that I later realized was that all of this was anecdotal, meaning that just as easily as we can have a bad outcome, we could easily have a good outcome, and it was all predicated on what we did on a day-to-day basis with our daughter, right? And those are the things, the day-to-day things, the 24/7, 365, week-to-week changes. Those are the things that are really hard to interpret and hard to put in a double-blinded, randomized, placebo-controlled trial, right? And so I say this all now because hindsight is 20/20, and right now I'm able to say that. But if you were to go back in time, right, it's a lot different when you're in the middle of it all. It's difficult when your entire livelihood is in this state of emotional turmoil. And so it's not really easy to think as logically as it is right now. And the crappy part about everything that I'm telling you right now is that the answer to what was wrong was sitting in her chart from her first birthday. But over the next 2 years, as she was seen by 9 different specialists, not one of them was able to connect the mitochondrial mutation to everything that we were seeing in her chart, her presentations, her signs, her symptoms. Each specialist read the mutation as just background noise for whatever label that they were happening to be treated at the time. And the unifying link that it represented stayed invisible to every single physician. And believe me, I tried. I told every specialist there was no way that this wasn't connected. But every single time, without fail, we got the same response. And that's that there wasn't enough data to suggest that there was a connection. But here's the thing, you don't need large population level data sets if you take the time to understand the physiology, if you take the time to understand biochemistry, mechanism of action. Now, again, that's the difference between the isolated visits that they experience with my daughter, right? Because they see snapshots in time. I saw the day-to-day struggle every single day. I experienced the patterns. I saw the trends over years that was invisible to every single specialist that we encountered over time. Even when we would bring my observations to their attention, it was often dismissed. And this really gave me a new level of empathy towards the patients that I've never had before. I was on the other side of a system that wasn't prepared to handle my daughter. Like I said, every single day was a struggle. I mean, she had oral ulcers, she had a malar RAS, absence seizures, nystagmus, she had acute dystonic reactions, mood dysregulation, insomnia, myalgias, myopathy. She was eating 200 to 300 calories a day because she was anorexic. She wasn't hungry, and she dropped below the first percentile for her weight. She was so weak from the myopathy that we had to carry her most days. We had to carry her inside of a grocery store. She wasn't able to walk because the fatigue would set in. We saw so many different specialists at so many different institutions. We saw hematology, neurology, rheumatology, genetics, GI, allergy and immunology, cardiology, mitochondrial medicine, and we saw developmental pediatrics. We did occupational therapy, physical therapy. We did feeding therapy. I mean, you name it. We tried it all. And the problem is each of these specialists worked on the part of her clinical picture that fell within her scope. Hematology wanted to start IVIG. Rheumatology was thinking rituximab. Well, GI wanted to put in a G-tube. There was a moment in this stretch that I'm not going to forget, and it's the thing that made everything click for me. See, we were sitting in front of an immunologist, and she told us that she specialized in the immune system and that autoimmune disease was outside of her wheelhouse. That should be left to rheumatology. An immunologist telling me that autoimmune disease wasn't in her wheelhouse. That was the moment that everything came into focus for me. That was the moment that everything clicked. That's when I saw the gap. That's when I really saw it. I mean, the immune system is integral to autoimmune disease, to autoimmune conditions, right? But that was the visit where everything finally clicked, because it didn't matter what came out of my mouth. It didn't matter what I was saying. They were focused on what they were focused on and nothing else. Nobody was asking, what is the unifying link between any of it? They were each treating the slice of her that fell inside their lane and defending and deferring everything else to the corresponding specialist. Now, this is all too common, not just in my daughter's case. It happens all the time in chronic disease, right? But the problem is this type of care creates fragmentation and it creates terrible outcomes long term. But that's the problem that we have in today's world of chronic disease. We create these specialties that are based on organ systems, right? We create diseases that are predicated on organ systems. We create board exams and then chunk everything down into organ systems, as if the disease respects these arbitrary labels that we've artificially created over the years. Everything in medicine, everything that I just described to you is man-made, but the underlying biology isn't. Yet we like to pretend that they are. And it's this type of reductionist thinking in medicine that's really harming the very population that we are trying to protect the most. And so by the time my daughter got sick, I just want you to know, I already had over 100,000 patient encounters under my belt. And I had built the company that you've been listening to for over a decade. In my eyes, I could pass any USMLE board exam with my eyes closed, but none of that mattered when it came to my daughter. For years, I had told myself, and I truly believed, that this standardized approach to care, this algorithmic approach across the country, was actually the strength of our system. That it was the very thing that allowed everybody to get the same level of care, right? The standard of care, regardless of where they happen to walk into, regardless of what hospital or what clinician, they received the standard of care. But I saw it fail on my daughter. And watching it fail, my daughter forced me to see something that I had been protected from seeing for a very long time. The algorithm, is fine when it matches the patient, but when it doesn't match the patient, well, the algorithm doesn't bend. And so the patient just keeps deteriorating inside of this system. Now, I want to be careful here because, look, the reality is the clinicians that saw my daughter, they were not bad doctors. They were smart, they were well-intentioned, and I know but nobody meant harm, okay? They were working as hard as the system would allow them to work. So the problem necessarily isn't the individual doctors, it's the system. It was the model that they had been handed and the constraints of each of these appointment slots that they were forced to work inside of, right? A busy specialist who has 20 minutes with a patient can't integrate the kind of upstream biology that I thought was necessary to help my daughter. And there's no realistic version of any of that visit which could have happened. Still, that doesn't negate my experience, and it doesn't negate the experience that so many people face in this country, right? This was the worst experience of my life. Having to comfort my daughter during 8-hour infusions of IVIG was hard. I'd come home and cry myself to sleep every single night because me and my wife, we genuinely didn't think that she would see her next birthday. And then came the bone marrow biopsy. And to do that biopsy, they gave her propofol. Now, propofol is dangerous in a patient who has mitochondrial mutation or dysfunction. It impairs the very part of the cell that's already failing in this kid. And it's something that it should never be given without understanding the underlying biology, especially in this use case. And unfortunately, the anesthesiologist who administered this didn't understand this fact. And because of that, my daughter stopped breathing on the table. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. My daughter stopped breathing during a routine procedure because the people taking care of her didn't understand her biology well enough to know what not to give her. Now, again, I don't fault the doctor. It's just the reality that we live in. The entire system is not built for complex patients like her. Eventually, I realized that nobody was coming to save her. Not the specialists, not the academic centers, not the algorithms, not the next best step. Nothing. If she was going to come back, I had to figure out how to bring her back myself. And again, look, I wasn't asking for a miracle and I wasn't asking for a cure. I just wanted my daughter to be functional. I just wanted her to be able to walk into a grocery store, to play on the playground, to have fun and enjoy life. At a certain point, I realized that I had two choices in front of me. I could keep watching her slip away, or I could go learn what the system had failed to give her. And something happened during this process that I honestly didn't expect. The passion that I once lost was back. But it wasn't the same passion that I had as a 24-year-old. It was a different kind of passion, driven by the realization that what I had been taught was not only incomplete, but in many cases was completely wrong. I realized that there was a whole world of biology underneath the disease labels that I had been managing for years that nobody had pointed me towards during any of my clinical training. I finally had a real purpose for my life. I had something worth devoting my entire career to, something that would change the world, in my opinion, for the better, something worth doing. Now, one of the biggest realizations that I had regarding the importance of health and disease in general was the understanding of mitochondria and what their role is here. Because I'm sure like you, I've been taught to think of mitochondria as nothing more the powerhouse of the cell. They generate ATP and that's what they do. And yes, that is true. But they do so much more than that. They're integral in almost every single chronic disease that we see in practice. And the entire continuum, they're integral between health and disease in that entire spectrum. And the longer I studied them, the more I realized that the cell itself and the mitochondria inside of the cell, this was the missing thing. This was the missing link from how I had been trained to practice medicine. It took my daughter's entire life, $100,000 out of pocket to figure out what was actually happening and what to do about it. I dove right into biochemistry, molecular biology, genetics, metabolomics, mitochondrial medicine, and most important of all, I started to learn about lifestyle and how lifestyle actually moves the needle. I slowly began to realize the therapeutic power of nutrition. Focusing on what we fed her began to show results that no other pharmacological intervention showed. Okay, that was my first clue that we were onto something. So I went back to school. Yes, I did a lot of self-studying, but I wanted to go back formally as well. And so I completed another master's degree, this time in personalized nutrition from the University of Connecticut. I went on to get a graduate certificate in precision nutrition, and then I completed a didactic program in dietetics from Cal State LA, and currently working on an internship in dietetics. The depth of what was missing from my original training really only became visible once I started to look for it. Because here's the thing, if you don't look for it, you won't find it. Conventional clinical training prepares you really well for one set of problems, but really poorly for another set of problems. Most of what we're trained as a clinician in medicine is for what's called pathogenesis. Pathogenesis is the study of how disease develops. It's been the dominant lens in medicine for the better part of the century. And I'll tell you right now, it's the right lens for acute care. When you have to identify quickly what's going on because you need to intervene to save someone's life, whether we're talking about a myocardial infarction, a sepsis, or a pulmonary embolism, that's what we need to know. But pathogenesis tells us what's wrong. But it doesn't tell us how to restore health. That's completely different. But just to be clear, if I get hit by a car tomorrow, there's nowhere else that I would rather be than an emergency department here in the United States, because that we have down pat. The problem becomes once we apply this pathogenesis lens to a chronic disease, well, in that instance, that's where we start to fail. Because in that instance, we start to manage the marker. In that instance, we replace what's missing. We suppress what's flaring, right? But the underlying biology keeps doing what it was doing. We were never taught a framework that actively moves the patient back towards health. Everything is reactive, rather than it being proactive. We were trained to manage disease, not treat cure. Chronic disease accounts for most of the illness, most of the disability and death in healthcare spending in this entire country. We have been trying to manage it using the same toolkit that we built for acute care, and the data is clearly showing that it's not working. If you look at the stats from the CDC, 75% of American adults are now living with at least one chronic condition. More than 50% have two. And 70% of all deaths in this country are downstream of a chronic condition. What's even more appalling and devastating, that should be the case, and it saddens me to even think about this, but 40% of our school-aged children here in the United States have at least one chronic condition. And when you include behavioral and mental health, that number skyrockets to 60%. There was an NHANES analysis that found that 6.8% of American adults meet the criteria for optimal cardiometabolic health. Only 6.8%. So let's flip that around. That means that roughly 93% of adults are walking around with poor or suboptimal cardiometabolic health. And depending on which condition we're talking about, between 40 to 80% of that chronic disease burden is attributed to modifiable lifestyle factors that the standard model of care just isn't really built to address. We're not winning this fight. We're losing. But it's not because there's a knowledge gap. The research is there, believe me. It's really a structural problem with how we conceptualize disease in the first place. But believe me, the research is there, it's published, there's multiple studies. You can find all of this on PubMed. But again, if you're not looking for it, then you're not going to find it, because you only find what you look for. Now, here's what I came to understand, and it really took me years to internalize, even with everything that I already had on the line. A diagnosis or a disease label isn't really anything specific. It's a name, right, that we've chosen to describe a constellation of signs, symptoms, labs, imaging. These values that cluster together often enough for us to be able to recognize them and for us to be able to then form a connection so that we can communicate to another clinician, right? The label is useful in that it lets clinicians communicate a phenotype to another clinician. It allows the insurance to pay claims, but it's not that useful when we're trying to figure out what is happening underlying, what is wrong, right? And if the label doesn't tell you what went wrong, then it certainly doesn't tell you how you can move the patient back towards a state of health. Because those are two very different things. There are many ways that someone can check the box for a given diagnostic label. In other words, there are many different reasons under the hood as to why somebody could be given a specific diagnosis. If that weren't true, if there was only one way to get a diagnosis, right? If a diagnosis always meant the same underlying pathology and the same road to health, then every single first-line intervention would work 100% of the time. But we know that's not the case. The other thing that we need to understand is that by the time a diagnosis is given, there has been underlying dysfunction for many, many years, right? By the time a patient meets diagnostic criteria for type 2 diabetes, for example, they've typically had insulin resistance for 10 years, for 20 years. The fasting glucose didn't magically spike 2 hours before their appointment. It crossed an arbitrary line that we drew on a continuum that had been moving in that same direction for at least a decade. The patient with a fasting glucose of 24 or 124 isn't, categorically or magically better or healthier than somebody with 126. They both have underlying cellular dysfunction, and the only thing that changed is the label, is the arbitrary line that we drew in the sand. That same logic applies to nearly every single chronic disease that we manage today. There is dysfunction that's happening at the cellular level and particularly at the mitochondrial level that begins long before any label can ever be applied. This is the part we miss. This is the asymptomatic stage. This is the part where we can really intervene. And by the time the label exists, we're intervening at the end of a process that has already been compounding for years and years and years. The medications that we have for most chronic diseases are doing exactly what they were designed to do, which is to manage symptoms, which is to shift lab values so that they fit inside this defined target range that we have created. They were not designed to address the upstream biology. We have essentially been asking the wrong tool to do a job that it was never built to do in the first place. We've been getting a hammer to hit a screw when a screwdriver is probably better suited for the job. The model that I had to teach myself in order to help my daughter is built on a completely different premise. It starts with the idea that the cell is the fundamental unit of life. The body is one organism. It's organized into systems, and these systems are deeply interconnected, but these are not organ systems, right? These are biological processes that is upstream of this organ system, of this phenotype. These processes or systems that are occurring at the cellular level. We shouldn't be focused on the organ level itself. We need to go deeper. Because if you remember physiology, basic physiology, organ systems are organs are made of tissues, and tissues are made up of cells. And so when the cell is dysfunctional, the tissue eventually becomes dysfunctional and so up on the chain. And by the time we have a recognized disease, we are watching the surface manifestation of cellular dysfunction that started years or even decades earlier. The work then is to identify, okay, what's driving the cellular dysfunction in this particular patient and how do we correct it? What do we do? And there's real science here. Behind this approach, behind this thoughts, behind all of this, including diseases that conventional medicine still considers to be either universally progressive or irreversible. And there's a physician known as Dr. Robert Naviau. He's out of UC San Diego, and he's done some of the most important work, in my opinion, in this area. His model of the cell danger response and the healing cycle is a big part of what reshaped how I think about everything as we think about health and disease. When you start to see the body this way, the mitochondrial mutation that was in my daughter's chart from day one stops being a finding, right, among many other findings and starts to look like the one unifying link, the unifying vulnerability that made the whole multi-system picture coherent. When the central process of cellular metabolism is compromised at that level, everything is compromised, right? Immune system is compromised. Cell-to-cell signaling is compromised. The entire cellular environment, everything destabilizes together. The serological abnormalities that we saw, the seizures, the dystonic reactions, the faltering growth, the myopathy, all of it became readable as just one biological problem, just expressed across various tissues. When we applied this lens to my daughter, this is when things started to shift. We stopped chasing labels and we started working on her cellular biology. Instead of asking what to prescribe in order to manage this autoimmune marker or this platelet count, we started asking, what does her biology need in order to come out of this chronic cell danger response back into a normal healing cycle? We stopped playing defense and we started to play offense. And unfortunately, I had to pay out of pocket for a lot of this, because the standard system wouldn't order it because it didn't fit any reimbursable workup. I built her plan around upstream biology. And honestly, I attribute 100% of her improvements to lifestyle interventions. nutrition being at the very center. She's 5 years old right now, and she's on no prescription medications. She's happy, she's joyous, she's smart. ANA went from positive to negative. All of her autoantibodies disappeared. Platelets are stabilized. Symptoms have completely resolved entirely. She gained weight and she's in the 25th percentile. She's swimming every single week. She rides her bike. She goes to the playground. She plays with the kids. She has friends. It's amazing. It's beautiful. She's meeting every single motor milestone and is ahead cognitively, which is amazing when you just think about and remember how many neurological complications she actually had early on. And yeah, we have a happy ending to our story, but unfortunately, many people do not. Many people are not fortunate enough to be able to dedicate the time, the resource, the energy to try to figure this out. And they deserve that. Still, there was a long stretch. There was a long period where I genuinely did not believe that she was going to be here anymore. And the fact that she's healthy and thriving, both subjectively and objectively, is a really strong piece of evidence from my perspective. You know, it's one of the most important things that I can offer you guys in terms of what the system was telling us and why it was wrong. And the thing is, if it was wrong about a case like hers, where she had more than a dozen different clinicians involved in her case, then it can certainly be wrong about a lot of the less complicated ones too. The cases where we arrogantly assume that we already have it all figured out. But let me remind you about our past and every single decade before us. If we've been wrong about the vast majority of things that we once labeled as fact, then surely we can be wrong about the many things that we believe dogmatically today. This is the part that I really can't stop thinking about. If this approach can move the needle for one of the hardest pediatric patients that I've ever encountered, then it almost certainly will work for the patient who's in your office tomorrow, for the type 2 diabetic, for the patient with Hashimoto's, for the patient with weight gain, or the unexplained fatigue, or the patient who maybe has this autoimmune picture that nobody can quite put the label on just yet. So they wait and see, right? The biology underneath all of these conditions is more shared than our specialty silos really suggest. And the interventions, once you understand the mechanisms, aren't all that exotic. A lot of what I believe in is grounded in lifestyle. But the thing is, it needs to be in a way where lifestyle is treated as a therapeutic intervention with the same level of rigor that we often associate with pharmaceuticals. And so this brings me back as to why I'm here today. I stepped away because I lost my passion for medicine, for health, for disease, because I had outgrown a model. And I stopped believing in it without quite really having the words for it early on. And now I'm back because my daughter forced me to confront the fact that the model that I once championed was completely wrong. She forced me to find the passion that I once lost. And it's back in a way that I wouldn't have thought possible 5 years ago. I now have a renewed purpose, one that allows me to pour my heart and soul into this every single day, to fight this fight. I finally found the thing that I want to dedicate the rest of my career to. Because the reality is, we need a new model for chronic disease. We need a new framework. What we're doing right now is not working. We need to rethink how our lifestyle can both be preventative and curative. And it is the work that I want to do in front of you for the next chapter of this company. So what you're going to see on this channel, what you're going to hear on this podcast is going to be completely different than what we've done before. Okay, the early Medgeeks content was built to help PAs and NPs get through school, pass the boards. We helped mentor primary care clinicians, and that work helped a generation of clinicians, and I'm really proud of it. But it's not what I want to do anymore. It's not what I want to teach anymore because it isn't what's going to help the population of patients that really need help the most. The reality is that even clinicians at some point will become a patient, or your family member will become a patient. So the sooner that we can start this work, the better the outcomes are going to be for everybody. And so what I want to teach now is the biology underneath the chronic disease epidemic that we have here in the United States. And I want to teach clinical reasoning that follows from it, how we can improve lifestyle to better this chronic disease epidemic. It's the kind of material that when you internalize it, changes the type of questions that you're asking so that you can ask better questions, so you can get better answers, so you can get better outcomes, especially for the patients who have been told for years that there's nothing else that can be done. This is life. You just have to deal with it. Or there's nothing wrong. Your labs look normal. Or maybe you should see psych, right? That's not right. That is not the answer. And so how we're going to do the format is going to vary. The depth is going to vary as well. But the hope is that everything here will be practical. Everything is going to be grounded in science. I am still very much a man of science. I believe in science. I don't just necessarily blindly anymore believe the dogma that has perpetuated in spite of all of the advances that we've made and have been published. I've learned more in the last 5 years than I did in the entire decade of clinical training and practice, leading up to this point. I also know that I don't know everything. And I don't think nobody knows everything, right? And that's okay. But I learn something new every single day. And what I want to offer you is I want to share all of the experiences that I learned up to this the hard way. And I also want to continue sharing everything that I'm learning with you every single day. But rather than what I'm going to share with you guys on the YouTube or the podcast next, I actually want to hear from you. Let me know. Drop a comment. Let me know what you want to discuss most right now. What's top of mind? What's most important? What do you feel that we should have a discussion on? And as we get this channel back up and running, please hit subscribe, like the video. If you're on the podcast, leave a review. This really helps spread the word. It'll help spread the science. And for patients out there, it'll really help spread hope. I'm glad that you're here. I'm grateful that you've been able to, or that you've wanted to, I should say, stick around long enough to find this episode. Thank you so much. I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Talk soon. Bye.